Welcome to another episode of Mike Reads. Today we'll be continuing in our series on Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson with Chapter 13, scare quotes, Parity Prices. As I've mentioned throughout the course of this series, we are doing this series as a parallel read with Thomas Sowell's Economic Facts and Fallacies, so I'll put a link in this video's description to that series so you can follow along there as well. As I've also mentioned throughout the course of this series, at the end of each read, we'll be doing an analysis and review of the read, so I'll put a timestamp in this video's description to that part of the video so you can jump straight to the analysis and review if that's how you'd like to go about things. So there's a little bit of housekeeping we need to go through before we dive into the read. First things first, as I've mentioned in the previous couple of reads, this chapter continues in a 4 or 5 chapter aside that Hazlitt goes into on commodities exchange and tariffs and foreign exchange. And this is as complicated as the entire read and the entire series is going to get. And if we're looking at Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson as an introduction into economics, and I kind of look at it that way, if this goes over your head, do understand that this is, again, the most complicated that these reads will get, and we will return to a more introductory level of economics in a few chapters here. And also that I don't consider commodities exchange and foreign markets as part of what I would put into, if I was building a lesson, an introductory lesson into economics. So again, if this goes over your head, I'll do my best in the analysis and review part of the video to try to explain it and to try to simplify the read so that you guys can better understand it. And again, eventually, and if just a few chapters, we'll be returning to a more introductory level economics. The last piece of housekeeping before we get started is that this read is a little bit on the long side. So Hazlitt breaks this chapter up into 3 parts. He only labels the parts numerically. So in this case, we have just 2 and 3. There is no label for part 1, so you'll have to excuse me while I insert a label for part 1 at the very beginning of the read, because I believe that was his intention anyways. So after we read the chapter's title, I'll just say part 1, and then we'll continue on with the read. Which, since we're done with our housekeeping, let's go ahead and dive right on into. And today's read is in Chapter 13, Parity Prices, Part 1. Special interests, as the history of tariffs reminds us, can think of the most ingenious reasons why they should be the object of special solicitude. Their spokesmen present a plan in their favor, and it seems at first so absurd that disinterested writers do not trouble to expose it. But the special interests keep on insisting on the scheme. Its enactment would make so much difference to their own immediate welfare that they can afford to hire trained economists and public relations experts to propagate it in their behalf. The public hears the argument so often repeated and accompanied by such a wealth of imposing statistics, charts, curves, and pie slices that it is soon taken in. When at last disinterested writers recognize that the danger of the scheme's enactment is real, they are usually too late. They cannot in a few weeks acquaint themselves with the subject as thoroughly as the hired brains who have been devoting their full time to it for years. They are accused of being uninformed, and they have the air of men who presume to dispute axioms. This general history will do as a history of the idea of quote-unquote parity prices for agricultural products. I forget the first day when it made its appearance in a legislative bill, but with the advent of the New Deal in 1933, it had become a definitely established principle enacted into law, and as year succeeded year, and its absurd corollaries made themselves manifest, they were enacted too. The argument for parity prices ran roughly like this. Agriculture is the most basic and important of all industries. It must be preserved at all costs. Moreover, the prosperity of everybody else depends upon the prosperity of the farmer. If he does not have the purchasing power to buy the products of industry, industry languishes. This was the cause of the 1929 collapse, or at least of our failure to recover from it. For the prices of farm products dropped violently, while the prices of industrial products dropped very little. The result was that the farmer could not buy industrial products. The city workers were laid off and could not buy farm products, and the depression spread in ever-widening vicious circles. There was only one cure, and it was simple. Bring back the prices of the farmer's products to a parity with the prices of the things the farmer buys. This parity existed in the period from 1909 to 1914, when farmers were prosperous. That price relationship must be restored and preserved perpetually. It would take too long and carry us too far from our main point to examine every absurdity concealed in this plausible statement. There is no sound reason for taking the particular price relationships that prevailed in a particular year or period and regarding them as sacrosanct, or even as necessarily more quote-unquote normal than those of any other period. Even if they were quote-unquote normal at the time, what reason is there to suppose that these same relationships should be preserved more than 60 years later, in spite of the enormous changes in the conditions of production and demand that have taken place in the meantime? The period of 1909 to 1914 as the basis of parity was not selected at random. In terms of relative prices, it was one of the most favorable periods to agriculture in our entire history. If there had been any sincerity or logic in the idea, it would have been universally extended. If the price relationships between agricultural and industrial products that prevailed from August 1909 to July 1914 ought to be preserved perpetually, why not preserve perpetually the price relationship of every commodity at that time to every other? When the first edition of this book appeared in 1946, I used the following illustrations of the absurdities to which this would have led. Quote, a Chevrolet six-cylinder touring car cost $2,150 in 1912. An incomparably improved six-cylinder Chevrolet sedan cost $907 in 1942. Adjusted for quote-unquote parity, on the same basis as farm products, however, it would have cost $3,270 in 1942. A pound of aluminum from 1909 to 1913 inclusive averaged 22.5 cents. Its price in early 1946 was 14 cents, but at quote-unquote parity, it would have then cost instead 41 cents, end quote. It would be both difficult and debatable to try to bring these two particular comparisons down to date by adjusting not only for the serious inflation consumer prices have more than tripled between 1946 and 1978, but also for the qualitative differences in automobiles in the two periods. But this difficulty merely emphasizes the impracticability of the proposal. After making, in the 1946 edition, the comparison quoted above, I went on to point out that the same type of increase in productivity had in part led also to the lower prices of farm products. Quote, in the 5-year period from 1955 through 1959, an average of 428 pounds of cotton was raised per acre in the United States, as compared with an average of 260 pounds in the 5-year period from 1939 to 1943, and an average of only 188 pounds in the 5-year base period, 1909 to 1913, end quote. When these comparisons are brought down to date, they show that the increase in farm productivity has continued, though at a reduced rate. In the 5-year period 1968 to 1972, an average of 467 pounds of cotton was raised per acre. Similarly, in the 5 years 1968 to 1972, an average of 84 bushels of corn per acre was raised, compared with an average of only 26.1 bushels in 1935 to 1939, and an average of 31.3 bushels of wheat was raised per acre, compared with an average of only 13.2 in the earlier period. Costs of production have been substantially lowered for farm products by better application of chemical fertilizer, improved strains of seed, and increasing mechanization. In the 1946 edition, I made the following quotation. Quote, on some large farms, which have been completely mechanized and are operated along mass production lines, it requires only 1/3 to 1/5 the amount of labor to produce the same yields as it did a few years back, end quote. Yet all this is ignored by the apostles of parity prices. The refusal to universalize the principle is not the only evidence that it is not a publicly spirited economic plan, but merely a device for subsidizing a special interest. Another evidence is that when agricultural prices go above parity, or are forced there by government policies, there is no demand on the part of the farm bloc in Congress that such prices be brought down to parity, or that the subsidy be to that extent repaid. It is a rule that works only one way. Part 2. Dismissing all these considerations, let us return to the central fallacy that specially concerns us here. This is the argument that if the farmer gets higher prices for his products, he can buy more goods from industry, and so make industry prosperous and bring full employment. It does not matter to this argument, of course, whether or not the farmer gets specifically so-called parity prices. Everything, however, depends on how these higher prices are brought about. If they are the result of general revival, if they follow from increased prosperity of business, increased industrial production, and increased purchasing power of city workers, not brought about by inflation, then they can indeed mean increased prosperity and production not only for the farmers, but for everyone. But what we are discussing is a rise in farm prices brought about by government intervention. This can be done in several ways. The higher price can be forced by mere edict, which is the least workable method. It can be brought about by the government standing ready to buy all the farm products offered to it at the parity price. It can be brought about by the government's lending to farmers enough money on their crops to enable them to hold the crops off the market until parity or a higher price is realized. It can be brought about by the government enforcing restrictions in the size of crops. It can be brought about, as it often is in practice, by a combination of these methods. For the moment, we shall simply assume that, by whatever method, it is in any case brought about. What is the result? The farmers get higher prices for their crops. In spite of reduced production, say, their quote-unquote purchasing power is thereby increased. They are for the time being more prosperous themselves, and they buy more of the products of industry. All this is what is seen by those who look merely at the immediate consequences of policies to the groups directly involved. But there is another consequence no less inevitable. Suppose the wheat, which would otherwise sell at $2.50 a bushel, is pushed up by this policy to $3.50. The farmer gets $1 a bushel more for wheat. But the city worker, by precisely the same change, pays $1 a bushel more for wheat and an increased price of bread. The same thing is true of any other farm product. If the farmer then has $1 more purchasing power to buy industrial products, the city worker has precisely that much less purchasing power to buy industrial products. On net balance, industry in general has gained nothing. It loses in city sales precisely as much as it gains in rural sales. There is, of course, a change in the incidence of these sales. No doubt the agricultural implement makers and the mail-order houses do a better business. But the city department stores do a smaller business. The matter, however, does not end there. The policy results not merely in no net gain, but in a net loss. For it does not mean merely a transfer of purchasing power to the farmer from city consumers, or from the general taxpayer, or from both. It also frequently means a forced cut in the production of farm commodities to bring up the price. This means a destruction of wealth. It means that there is less food to be consumed. How this destruction of wealth is brought about will depend upon the particular method pursued to bring prices up. It may mean the actual physical destruction of what has already been produced, as in the burning of coffee in Brazil. It may mean a forced restriction of acreage, as in the American AAA plan, or its revival. We shall examine the effect of some of these methods when we come to the broader discussion of government commodity controls. But here it may be pointed out that when the farmer reduces the production of wheat to get parity, he may indeed get a higher price for each bushel, but he produces and sells fewer bushels. The result is that his income does not go up in proportion to his prices. Even some of the advocates of parity prices recognize this, and use it as an argument to go on to insist upon parity income for farmers. But this can only be achieved by a subsidy at the direct expense of taxpayers. To help the farmers, in other words, it merely reduces the purchasing power of city workers and other groups still more. Part 3. There is one argument for parity prices that should be dealt with before we leave the subject. It is put forward by some of the more sophisticated defenders. Quote, yes, end quote, they will freely admit, quote, the economic arguments for parity prices are unsound. But such prices are a special privilege. They are an imposition on the consumer. But isn't the tariff an imposition on the farmer? Doesn't he have to pay higher prices on industrial products because of it? It would do no good to place a compensating tariff on farm products, because America is a net exporter of farm products. Now the parity price system is the farmer's equivalent of the tariff. It is the only fair way to even things up, end quote. The farmers that asked for parity prices did have a legitimate complaint. The protective tariff injured them more than they knew. By reducing industrial imports, it also reduced American farm exports because it prevented foreign nations from getting the dollar exchange needed for taking our agricultural products. And it provoked retaliatory tariffs in other countries. Nonetheless, the argument we have just quoted will not stand examination. It is wrong even in its implied statement of the facts. There is no general tariff on all quote-unquote industrial products or on all non-farm products. There are scores of domestic industries or of exporting industries that have no tariff protection. If the city worker has to pay a higher price for woolen blankets or overcoats because of a tariff, is he compensated by having to pay a higher price also for cotton clothing and for foodstuffs? Or is he merely being robbed twice? Let us even it all out, say some, by giving equal quote-unquote protection to everybody. But that is insoluble and impossible. Even if we assume that the problem could be solved technically, a tariff for A, an industrial subject to foreign competition, a subsidy for B, an industrialist who exports his product, it would be impossible to protect or to subsidize everybody fairly or equally. We should have to give everybody the same percentage, or would it be the same dollar amount, of tariff protection or subsidy, and we could never be sure when we were duplicating payments to some groups or leaving gaps with others. But suppose we could solve this fantastic problem. What would be the point? Who gains when everyone equally subsidizes everyone else? What is the profit when everyone loses in added taxes precisely what he gains by his subsidy or his protection? We should merely have added an army of needless bureaucrats to carry out the program, with all of them lost to production. We could solve the matter simply, on the other hand, by ending both the parity price system and the protective tariff system. Meanwhile, they do not, in combination, even out anything. The joint system merely means that farmer A and industrialist B both profit at the expense of forgotten man C. So the alleged benefits of still another scheme evaporate as soon as we trace not only its immediate effects on a special group, but its long-run effects on everyone. All right, that concludes today's read. Now on to the analysis and review part of the video. All right, welcome to the analysis and review part of the video. So the chapter 13 is all about parity prices. So before we get started with an analysis and review, we have to explain and define what parity pricing is. So parity pricing is the relative price of a good compared to other goods and services over time. So if we look at, for example, the price of a pencil versus the price of a Sharpie, the price of the pencil in 1985 relative to the price of the Sharpie in 1985 might be, say, 50 cents to $1 or something like that. I have no idea what it actually was. But today, that price might be 25 cents to $1. So the pricing in 2021 relative to 1985 might not be, the relative difference in price might not be in parity, as in the difference between the price of the pencil and of the Sharpie might not be identical from 1985 to 2021. And the way that you would hear an argument for the sort of thing is something that Hazlitt doesn't actually do a good job of defining parity pricing in the chapter, but he does do a good job of defining illustrating at least what an argument or a proponent for parity pricing would sound like. And that happens on page 91, where he's talking about the parity pricing that existed from 1909 to 1914 with farmers and other goods and services. That price relationship must be restored and preserved perpetually. So a proponent of parity pricing would say that the 2-to-1 ratio of the price of Sharpies to pencils must also be the ratio of the price of Sharpies to pencils in 2021. And this is usually applied to farm goods. It's not usually applied in the case of proponents of the idea to other goods and services. And the question of why not, the obvious question of why not apply it to other goods and services is one Hazlitt raises on page 92. Why not preserve perpetually the price relationship of every commodity at that time to every other? So I gave you the example of the parity pricing of the pencil to the Sharpie. The good and service that I usually prefer to provide an example of is the cathode ray tube television. So those big clunky televisions from the 90s and early 2000s. Nobody uses them anymore. And right now, in many cases, you have to pay somebody to get rid of them. So in that case, in certain respect, the price of a cathode ray tube today is negative. So what should be the price of the cathode ray tube to, say, the video game console that's being plugged into it? Now, I realize I'm using video game console on purpose because there is a tiny hyper niche market for cathode ray televisions even today, and that is in the Smash Brothers Melee community, where in order to get the exact frame specifications, the maximum capability of the game and the television that is producing the image, you need to use a cathode ray television, cathode ray tube television. So in this case, why not apply parity pricing to cathode ray tube TVs? And why not apply that cathode ray tube TV relative price to other goods and services? Let's say we're comparing it to a Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Well, in the case of the SNES in 1992, the price of the television, this cathode ray tube, to the price of the SNES was a number greater than zero. I don't know what it would be, but it would be a number greater than zero. However, what's the price of a cathode ray tube to the price of a SNES today? Well, anyone who has a working and functioning Super Nintendo is going to get money for it if they post it on eBay. In fact, they're probably going to get good money because Nintendo doesn't make them anymore. And there are still people who want to play those old cartridge games because they were great games and that was a great system. But let's say it's not even the SNES. Let's say it's the Wii U or the Nintendo Switch now. Well, what's the relative price difference between a cathode ray tube television today and the Nintendo Switch? Again, it's going to be a negative number. So how do you restore that parity pricing? Do you make the Nintendo Switch less than free? Do you force Nintendo to pay customers to take the Nintendo Switches off of their hands? Or do you force people to, do you set a price floor for the cathode ray tube televisions? Well, then how do you get rid of them? If you have to pay somebody to get rid of a cathode ray tube television, what are you going to do? Well, in my mind, you're just going to introduce black markets where people are just hurling them into the woods, which nobody wants. So I think we can all see why this is dumb, and I don't really have any other way to describe this as being anything other than incredibly dumb. So I have in my notes on page 92. So in this case, when we're talking about the cathode ray tubes, one of the things that gets missed by the proponents of parity pricing isn't just the prices themselves, but in the qualitative differences between the relative and nominal and absolute qualitative differences between the prices of goods and services. And he talks about this with the Chevrolet on page 92, and he talks about the difference between the quality of cars in 1912 and the quality of cars in 1942 and the quality of cars in 1946. And he talks about the change in prices between 1946 and 1978, but also for so it would be both difficult and debatable to try to bring these two particular comparisons down to date by adjusting not only for serious inflation between 1946 and 1978, and this is the important part, but also for the qualitative differences in automobiles in the two periods. So again, if we're just talking about televisions generally, what did televisions look like in 1992? What do televisions look like in 2021? What does let's say half of your week's pay towards a television look like in 1992? What does half of your week's pay look like in terms of a television today? Today, you can, for $300, get a very nice, and I mean very nice, you could probably get a smart TV, a very nice 1080p 60 frames per second smart TV that's 32 inches on the diagonal for around $300, and that's if it's brand new, never mind used. Well, what TV could you get for whatever the effective equivalent of $300 was in 1992? Could you even get one? And what would a smart TV that's 32 inches on the diagonal, that's a flat panel LCD TV that has a maximum display capacity of, say, 1080p 60 frames per second, what would that go for in $1992? I mean, that'd be a multi-million-dollar television back then, and multiple millions of dollars was worth a heck of a lot more in 1992 than it is today. So this notion of parity pricing and the purported benefits of parity pricing, the simplest way to describe it is just obviously dumb. And this is one of the many things that Keynes got wrong. And we'll have to talk about this. We'll have to talk about that in another video. But aside from the obvious, which we just went over, the goal, as Henry Hazlitt mentioned in the previous read, isn't the price. The goal isn't the money. The goal is productivity. And this is something that Adam Smith mentions in book 3 of The Wealth of Nations, and he continues on in book 4 on that. I'll link to that read in this video's description so you guys can check that out. But he wrote that in 1776, so this is hundreds of years before Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. So we've done this for a long time. That, the goal is productivity, and if you don't have interference with mutually consensual transactions, what you will have is increased production and increased productivity, and you'll have technological advancement. And as a result of the maximization and increase in productivity and technological advancement, you'll not only will prices decline in real terms, nominal and absolute prices will decline. We've seen this in the example mentioned before with cathode ray TVs. What did cathode ray TVs cost in 1992? Let's say, even if you were to get a brand, if there was a manufacturer dumb enough to start producing cathode ray TVs today, what would they go for? What would they go for today in not even in real dollars, but just in nominal price? They would probably have to not only give them away, they would probably have to pay people to take them off of their hands. The same thing is true of laser vision correction surgery. If you looked at laser vision correction surgery in 1990 versus 2000 versus 2010 versus 2020, this is a largely unregulated market. And it involves healthcare in some way because you are improving your vision. It's an element of surgery in the human body, and the nominal price of this sort of thing has actually declined over the years. And this is something that I've talked about in greater depth in my series on interference, which I'll link to in this video's description as well. So the goal is production, and we're going to get into now going beyond Smith's lesson, but also taking the argument for parity pricing to its logical end. And, Hazlitt actually does a good job of doing that and sticking to farm goods, which is where you usually hear this argument. So Hazlitt points out that this is just a way of picking favorites. And we don't like it when the Fed bails out hedge funds. We don't like it when the Fed bails out incompetent airlines. We don't like it when the Fed bails out incompetent car companies. So if we do things like that, like taking this argument to its logical end, you kind of wind up in some really dumb areas that even proponents of parity pricing would not agree to. Hazlitt points that out a few times, and we'll start with page 93, and this is one of the better arguments against this. By the way, this is one of my favorite reads in this book. The refusal to universalize the principle, taking it to its logical end, is not the only evidence that it is not a public-spirited economic plan, but, and here's his point, merely a device for subsidizing a special interest. And someone might say that this special interest is more important than any other, but, and we'll get back to that in just a moment here, but he also goes on to debunk this whole idea too when you take it to its logical end, because of what if we just stick to farm goods? Another evidence is that when agricultural prices go above parity, or are forced there by government policies, there is no demand on the part of the farm bloc in Congress that such prices be brought down to parity, or that the subsidy be to that extent repaid. It is a rule that only works one way. So if it was an actually principled position, what you would suggest is that if parity pricing is important, that means that when the price of eggs, when the price of wheat, when the price of milk, when the price of beef goes up and above what it was in relative terms 5 years ago, let's just say because of some natural event, well then, why wouldn't you hear those same proponents saying, oh, well, we got to fix that by forcing that price down? And he talks about a lot of ways that can manifest in part two. And we don't really need to focus on that in our analysis here, because the idea is the same no matter how it comes to materialize. So the most important lesson, aside from the production lesson, is the lesson that we get actually from Smith. And that is that no matter how you define, how you pair this all out, the thing that is important is mutual consent between the transactions. Because if we wanted to spend our money on a certain thing, then obviously the most efficient way to spend that money is the way that has the greatest return to the common consumer. And the only way to determine that is with mutual consent. Hazlitt actually does a great job of debunking this. So you'll have to excuse me, folks. If you get really nothing out of this read, this is the paragraph that matters. And I know it's a whole paragraph, but we're going to reread it again. But there is another consequence no less inevitable. Suppose the wheat, which would otherwise sell at $2.50 a bushel, is pushed up by this policy to $3.50 a bushel. The farmer gets $1 a bushel more for wheat. True. But the city worker, by precisely the same change, pays $1 a bushel more for wheat in an increased price of bread. The same thing is true of any other farm product. If the farmer then has $1 more purchasing power to buy industrial products, the city worker has precisely that much less purchasing power to buy industrial products. On net balance, industry in general has gained nothing. It loses in city sales precisely as much as it gains in rural sales. But this is not actually a one-to-one exchange, and we know this because, again, of Smith's lesson. If you remove the mutual consent from the transaction, then you remove the obvious and axiomatic gain from those transactions. If you shift them to another transaction, then what would normally manifest under entirely mutual consensual terms, what you have done is taken the maximum and the most efficient transaction that those parties are willing to engage in and shifting it to a different transaction. So in this case, you've actually interfered with the mutual consent within the transaction. And in that case, because of the interference, everybody in the end doesn't just break even, they lose. So part three, Hazlitt brings up, and as a brief aside, and this will just kind of wrap us up here, what about when parity pricing is used as a way to compensate as in effect damages for tariffs? Well, I mean, there's a really simple solution to this. I don't know why he winds up spending almost 2 pages on this, but on page 97 he says it in one sentence. We could solve the matter simply, on the other hand, by ending both the parity price system and the protective tariff system. In short, the solution to bad code, if you're looking in the coding world, isn't to pile on more code. It's to take the bad code and fix the bad code. In coding terms, this is what we call spaghetti code. So instead of having a nice organized, this leads to this, leads to this, leads to this, you end up having, oh God, well, there's this mess. Okay, so let's pile up more mess on top of that. Let's pile up more mess. It winds up looking like a bowl of spaghetti rather than a nice, neat, and organized coding system. So the solution from the Fed isn't more interference with mutual consensual transactions. the solution from the Fed, because we're talking about the Fed, who is capable of implementing the tariff and is also capable of removing the tariff, is for the Fed to remove the tariff. So that's basically all we have to really say about that read. Again, if it went over your head, I hope this analysis has helped to simplify the read. And we will continue in our next read and Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson with chapter 14, which is saving the X industry. So until then, this has been Mike, signing off.